Hello, and welcome everyone to this session that forms part of Renew's Green Rebuild Toolkit Beyond BAL project. My name is Nathan, and I'm the editor of Renew magazine. I begin our session this evening by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the respective lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's unique culture and spiritual relationships to the land and sea, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I also recognise that we have people tuned in from all over the country today, from a wide variety of traditional lands. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri country, and I encourage you to share where you're joining from in the chat. Tonight's session focuses on high vegetation risk and bushfire resilient designs, and it's the last event in our Beyond BAL series, which has been running each Monday night for the past 4 weeks. The Beyond BAL project has been generously funded by grants from Global Giving and the federal government's Black Summer Bushfire Recovery Grants program. Over the webinar series, we're featuring 12 case studies developed as part of our ongoing work to support communities rebuilding after bushfire. The homes in our case studies have resilient design elements and building approaches that extend our understanding of best practice beyond the Bushfire Attack Level, or BAL, rating system. Tonight, we'll be showcasing 3 homes in detail and talking to those who designed them. There'll be a short presentation on each, followed by a discussion between our expert, Nigel, and the architect involved. They will try to answer any questions you have about the case study, but just to let you know, we may not get to all of them. In the last half hour, we'll bring the full panel together to discuss the topic of high vegetation risk, and I'll be putting your questions to our experts. During our sessions, you can put questions into Zoom's Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. You can also use the chat window on the bottom right corner of the screen to make general comments or to contact our behind-the-scenes team with any technical problems. Before we dive in, I also want to take a moment to speak about Renew, the organisation behind the Beyond BAL project. Renew is a non-profit, member-based organisation that works to transform Australian homes for climate and energy resilience. We do this in numerous ways, including running free events like this one, as well as our flagship event, Sustainable House Day. We produce independent expert resources like the Green Rebuild Toolkit and Getting Off Gas Toolkit. We inspire and educate through our 2 magazines, Renew and Sanctuary, and we advocate for a fair energy transition on behalf of Australian households. We do all of this with a very tiny team of hardworking staff on a shoestring budget. And we've been around for over 40 years, and we intend to be around for the next 40. We know that times are tough, but we really encourage you to make a donation if you've found value in this event series in particular. You can also consider joining Renew as a member or taking out a subscription to one or both of our magazines. These are all meaningful ways that you can support us to make important change Australia-wide. Okay, let's get started. So firstly, we have Ian Weir presenting on the Apex Point House. Ian is a registered architect in WA, Tasmania, Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales, and has contributed to the Australian Bushfire Building Standard AS3959. He's a passionate advocate for biodiversity conservation and works exclusively on bushfire resilient projects. Thanks, Ian. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be presenting the Apex Point House on the Tasman Peninsula. And you might be wondering what this image is on the screen. Essentially what I'm presenting on is the relationship between innovation and bushfire. And you might ask, well, what right have I got to speak about innovation and bushfire? Well, I've been an industrial designer for 33 years, registered architect for 23. I was the research architect and head of landscape architecture at QUT for 13 years. Founding member of the Bushfire Building Council of Australia, and one of the key contributors to the current standard that we use for our BAL assessments. This is actually the house that I grew up in. So photo taken about 65 years ago, and in southern Western Australia. So the first 12 years of my life was in that house, in this spot here. And so around about 20 years ago, I bought some of that landscape prior to the clearing, of course. It's called Kongan. It's actually the most botanically diverse region in Australia, second only in botanical diversity to the Cape Province district in South Africa. So, I mean, it's more biodiverse plant species than any rainforest anywhere on Earth. This is how we're building in that landscape. We're doing what we did on my farm back in the 1960s. We're just clearing the hell out of it. So this is what the regulators are telling us to do, build a conventional house with a 20-metre clearing around it, or in AS 3959 terms, a BAL 29 project. That's essentially what it looks like in that extraordinary landscape. So this is my driver. This is my passion. I hate to see vegetation and biodiversity bullied. I had a lot of involvement with Black Saturday. This is one of the houses in Black Saturday. It just shows straight away, it doesn't matter how big your asset protection zone is. If you're not protected against ember attack, then it's as good as nothing. So 90% of houses are lost through ember attack in Australia, CSIRO stats. But about 100% of those are unregulated houses. So let's not confuse the houses that are built to AS 3959 and other standards that we can use with that stat. So this is predominantly our unregulated houses that in most part have no right to survive bushfires. We're also got to be careful when we look at images like this. This is a house nearby in Black Saturday, 2009. The house here has actually ignited the trees around the house rather than around the other way. I know this. I've been to the site, studied it. If we look at the photo carefully, we can actually see that. So let's be careful how we look at images. So this kind of passion has led me to not only conserve biodiversity in my own projects, but to celebrate it and in effect almost grant it personhood, as in legal personhood. My view is that an architect's sustainability priority, particularly in bushfire projects, is biodiversity conservation. Everything else is just a tool to achieve that. So all of this kind of advocacy and real work that I've done has been recognised by the New York Times with a special profile they wrote on me. And a lot of this whole narrative that I've just gone through is covered in that story. You can just get on your internet and check that out. So that image, the background image behind me in the New York Times article is the house in question that I'm talking about tonight. So the Apex Point house in Tasmania with this extraordinary wind-prune heathland, very, very similar to that remarkable biodiverse landscape in southern Western Australia. But of course, here we're in Tasmania. We're actually 10 k's from Port Arthur, right down on the Tasman Peninsula. We're on a 3.8 hectare site, so it's a really large site. And when you stand on the site, you just naturally sort of gravitate to looking to the southwest, which happens to be where all the prevailing winds come from, which are typically around about 40 knots, which made the house quite hard to build. This is a view looking from the leeward side of the house, because it has a very distinct leeward side as opposed to a windward side, looking through the house, and we see Wedge Island, and if it was a clear day, we'd see Bribie Island beyond. So yes, it's a remarkable, stunning looking house. I'm very proud of it. And this image gives the impression that we arrived at a pristine site and colonised it nicely with a bit of mid-century modern architecture. Well, actually, it was a bit more involved than that. We could have chose anywhere to build on that 3.8 hectare site. If we had chose in the middle of the heath, we would have destroyed it. Just like those black and white photos I showed earlier on, we would have just annihilated it because the movement patterns around the house, just walking but driving, any kind of access to it would have created a huge wind erosion problem. The other thing is that this is my view. We're inhabiting these sites for the first time in a sedentary sense. I mean, in the history of the site. It doesn't matter how many thousand years you go back. It's the first time. And as architects, we've really got to stop and think about what we're actually doing. It's the first time someone has actually lived there in a sedentary sense. It doesn't matter how good or bad your architecture is. You've got to start with that point of view. So this site was actually a very degraded dune blowout. So it was just four-wheel drivers, probably over the last 20 years when four-wheel drives really took off, that drove over the site to get to the fishing spots and so on. It's about a 3-metre deep hole. We built the house on that hole. The mapping was actually incorrect in the Tasmanian sort of overlays. It said that it was high protection biodiversity. Our landscape ecologist, bushfire attack assessor, determined that it was actually low biodiversity woodland, but still remarkable trees. So that enabled us to actually build up close to that woodland on the actual ridge line of the dunescape. Now, what's distinctive about bushfire regulations in WA and Tasmania in particular is that unless you've got an extremely high level of protection of vegetation, or you're against a fence line, which is against an estuary reserve and so on, you've just got to clear up to 20 metres around the house, roughly speaking, to create a BAL 29 project. So meaning a cleared low fuel area, which emits, supposedly BAL 29 or 29 kilowatts per square metre of radiant heat. And then a house, you can build whatever BAL house you like, but it can't be any lower than BAL 29. Now, this is the other end of what, Glenn Murcutt experienced at Palm Beach, where he had to protect every single eucalyptus anguphora. Actually, I don't think they're eucalyptus, but the anguphora trees. And literally we see architecture like this. It's virtually impossible to build houses like this in WA and Tasmania. So what do we do if we want to celebrate the biodiversity? Well, one thing I did was I got on the Australian standard, spent many years on that, and got this new way of assessing vegetation. So now when we're looking at forest, woodlands and rainforests, we classify the unmanaged understory rather than either the canopy drip line or the trunk line of trees. So this is really significant, because what was happening before 2018 version of the standard is people were assessing the BALs from the edge of the tree, and that house would suddenly be flame zone when really it will say BAL 29 or even lower. So a very, very expensive house to build. And invariably that would just trigger the removing of the tree. And the tree is just an innocent party to all this, because it's being misread as being the problem. But really it's what the tree drops that's the problem, and that's pretty darn easy to clear up. So let's not mistake trees for what they drop. So if we actually look at a cross-section through this BAL 29 project in Tasmania, we see how the actual vegetation management works. We've got the wind-prune coastal heath on the left-hand side. We've got the eucalyptus woodland on the right-hand side, and we're managing the understory, which was actually low biodiversity anyway. It was an invasive species of ferns. So we're actually able to keep the trees in there for amenity, for mitigating wind erosion and wind pressures and so on, and keep the biodiversity. So it's a BAL 29 project, and importantly, it's in Tasmania. If we were to cite this same project, and in Tasmania, we are just dealing with a moderate level of bushfire. That's the design fire in AS 3959. As soon as that fire intensity goes up, or the FFDI goes up, then we've got a BAL 40 house, and when it gets into catastrophic, which we do get those conditions in Tasmania, then the house is effectively exposed to flame zone. So I had to make sure there was some level of redundancy in the design that didn't just deal with the Tasmanian FFDI of 50 at BAL 29. I actually made the house more resilient than what it needed to be. We see the overall scheme here with the fire appliance turnaround circles where the water tanks are and so on. I'm coming down the home straight here. We see the house in its site. This is during construction still, so we don't see the managed ferns on the right-hand side here, and we don't see the regrowth on the other side. We see here the wind-protected leeward's courtyard. Courtyard's made by the house and the vegetation. We looking to the north, and importantly, the trees are here moderating, not just providing shade and increasing the moisture in the landscape around the house, which is great for bushfire risk mitigation, but reducing glare and, as I said, reducing wind pressures on the house. It's a narrow house. It's derived from the geology of the site as much as many other factors. It's site welded steel, which has got a very high resilience in bushfire. 10 mil steel is pretty much good for flame zones. So that's another aspect of it. The cladding doesn't have any external fixtures, so the roof and the walls are actually clipped on, and the glass is actually just glued on to the steel frame. You're probably thinking, okay, with a high fire, the glue is going to melt, windows are going to pop out. Well, let's just wait and see, shall we? I very much doubt it, because all the glue is protected by fire-rated silicon. So this is actually my last slide. So I just want to make some acknowledgements here that my research over many years and my contribution to AS 3959 has been a great assistance from the CSIRO's Bushfire Behaviour and Risk team, and also their Bushfire Adaptation team. And, I was supported by the Bushfire Building Council of Australia for many years, and also my own university, which I'm no longer part of. And I'd like to thank Standards Australia Committee for especially those members that accepted and adopted my many, many contributions to the standard over many years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Incredible Incredible project. So I'd like to now invite Nigel Bell to join us. And Nigel has been working closely with Renew to select the Beyond BAL case studies. He brings a wealth of experience developed through 4 decades working as an architect in the fire-prone Blue Mountains, and has been a sustainability leader in the bushfire resilience field for more than 2 decades. He represents the Australian Institute of Architects on the 3 Bushfire Standards Committee, and has just returned from California and West Coast Canada researching their wildfire building response. So if you do have any questions for Nigel or Ian about this particular case study, then please put them in the Q&A box right now. Otherwise, Nigel and Ian will have a short conversation before we get to those questions. Nigel, over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Ian. Obviously, a very stylish home, carefully sited, obviously, again, sitting on top of the ridge. Not normally the ideal location in terms of fire, which with every 5 or 10 degrees massively increases the speed and intensity. But that said, as you've said, it's very particular vegetation, heathland fire vegetation below, and the eucalypts are on the lee side. So for the audience, Ian, how would you deal differently with a house which was perhaps surrounded by eucalypt forest rather than having it on the lee side? Would your design approach be different in that regard?
Well, yes. I mean, if anybody sort of looks at my website, they'll see every house is radically different. So, the first step is really getting that understanding of the fuel loads of the site and what the actual available fuel loads are. And that means, a really good independent BAL assessment right up front. And, for a complex site, which might have forests and other vegetations that might not be well represented in AS 3959, use an assessor that's, very highly qualified, so level 3 BPAD, and do what's called a method 2 assessment. So that's kind of the first step. So apart from stylistically and all of those other issues, which are, of course, that would be a radically different approach. But, the first step is really getting that objective kind of understanding of what the actual available fuel loads are. Yeah.
You've mentioned there the point of alternative solution, or implied that.
Yep.
Could you explain a bit more to the audience of what that means, deemed to satisfy compared to an alternative solution? Our audience probably not sure what it means.
Sure, Nigel. Yeah, I think you're referring to some of the background conversations that have happened between myself and the Renew team and yourself, which is more around the energy efficiency. And I know that's a key kind of part of the toolbox that Renew is really promoting. So in this case, with the energy efficiency, because we've got a house that's basically facing south, which is, worst case for passive solar, we actually have an in-slab hydronic heating, which gets us, we meet the National Construction Code requirements for comfort. And then we meet the National Construction Code requirements for carbon emissions, which is the performance statement that sits above all the energy efficiency statements in the NCC, or did at the time this house went through a couple of years ago. It's changed a little bit now, unless you're in WA or Queensland. So what I'm getting at here is that we used a renewable energy source to offset the carbon emissions that might otherwise have been consumed unnecessarily by that hydronic heating to get the comfort. There's no way that even triple glazing could have given us the comfort. So it's very much a pay up front with $40,000 grid connected solar system, which is okay, and then offset all the energy. So it's kind of a moot point regarding energy efficiency. It doesn't actually it doesn't expel any carbon into the atmosphere. So why should the world care, kind of thing? Yeah.
Okay. And interestingly, whilst most fire protective layers tend to be board sheet products, you've went for TBA Firefly. Can you perhaps explain how it does work and why you selected that particular product?
Yeah, so the TBA Firefly product I've got a lot of confidence in, and I've used it on quite a few projects. The little exemplar project I showed really early on my slide, all in the bush, that uses a kind of 1 mil thick version of it, which is basically, it's oxidized acrylic. So any material that's oxidized simply cannot be burnt anymore. So, it's used in fire protection things and furnaces and so on, and, gloves and so on and so forth. So it's actually really over-engineered in the bushfire sense. I use it as a second line of defense. And I really think we need to be thinking of second lines of defence. So my external line of defence is, of course, the steel cladding and roof sheeting. And, we don't have any penetrations through that because it's clipped on, concealed, fixed. So that's a good, we're heading in the right direction. But it can fail, of course, like with a decent amount of heat on it, over a decent amount of time, it's going to buckle like crazy. We need to acknowledge that, particularly this house, as the viewers might have seen, as a timber frame. So we've got to protect that timber frame. The last thing we want is embers getting into where we can't see. It's one thing to have them coming in the house while you're there where you can see them, but it's another thing for them being in the roof space and in the wall space. So that sheeting, and I use the permeable one, so the one that's better for condensation control. That's just a fantastic kind of second line of defence, and they put the two together and you're pretty confident that even when we get up to catastrophic conditions, that wall system's going to be good to go. Good to not go.
Well, hopefully it never gets tested in that way, because certainly in the experience of some of the bushfires I'm very familiar with, the steel cladding twisted, buckled, the fixings were the first point of failure. And even when I'm thinking of one particular case for a local builder to where I am in the Blue Mountains, his office went up 10 metres away, but the intensity of the heat meant that they had to replace all the metal cladding all the way around the house 10 metres and more away. So, yes, in that case, you do need that extra backup level of support just to ensure the building survives, even though it might be heavily damaged.
That's right. It's a kind of insurance. It's not required under AS 3959 or the NASH standard, the kind of other standard. So it's kind of something you've got to talk to your clients about and say, look, we need a bit of redundancy in here, use that sort of technical term, and a bit of insurance. But the issue is that, yes, the house will be probably significantly damaged if it actually gets a BAL 29 event or higher. So, that's an insurance issue as well, like making sure you're actually covered for replacing the wall cladding and so on. Yeah.
Sure. And just to explain briefly, NASH is the alternative National Association of Steel Frame, and that is a direct deemed to satisfy alternative to AS 3959 without trying to say much more about it at this point of time.
Yeah.
Nathan.
Yeah, I'm just going to get in with one quick audience question before we move to our next case study. So someone's saying they're referencing a website that says Tasmania and the ACT have restricted new homes to have a maximum BAL 29 bushfire rating.
Yes.
Does this mean that no new houses can be built in areas with BAL zones higher than 29? Correct. Simple as that.
Then it might come back to, as Ian has suggested, if you have a particularly well-qualified consultant, they might be able to argue the toss and, negotiate a solution. But commonly, no, it's not available. And that's, of course, an indication of what could be happening in other states and territories in future years.
Yeah, but hopefully what I've shown tonight in summary is that it doesn't mean a scarified landscape like the black and white photos I showed at the early part of my presentation. That in my case, this heath we can mow, get it down to what's called low threat state and keep the biodiversity and wind erosion kind of mitigation there. And with the woodland, we've actually kept the trees and managed underneath them so we can't get a ladder effect fire into the canopy and have that sort of worst case scenario. So hopefully that's what architects and viewers and consumers are seeing in my presentation is there's BAL 29 and then there's BAL 29. There's, you with the right approach, you can still have amenity around the home.
Great. Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Nigel. So we'll now move on to the second case study with Morgan Jenkins presenting on the Mount Coot-tha project. Morgan Jenkins is a director at Brisbane-based architectural practice Nielsen Jenkins. And the firm explores key ideas of landscape, subtraction, connections, and materiality in order to achieve client-specific outcomes that are responsive to context and place. These explorations form the basis of all its work, from residential and commercial architecture to furniture construction and design. The work of the practice has been published and awarded both in Australia and internationally. I'll hand it over to you, Morgan. G'day.
G'day, guys. Sharing my screen. I just want to start with it, sort of preface it by saying that I'm in no way an expert at this, and hopefully this rings true for a few of you watching. But this was the first project that we have done with a BAL rating of any kind. It was a BAL 40 project. yeah, I'm one of the directors of Jenkins, and we work up here in Brisbane on Jagera and Turrbal country. We've got active projects in southeast Queensland and Victoria, actually a few in Cape Town at the moment as well. So this house is really special to me, and this place is really special to me. It is in the foothills of Mount Coot-tha on the western side of the Brisbane CBD. And it's next door to the house that I grew up in. So my parents bought the house in 1974 during the floods. And this house here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the house, there's a tennis court in the middle of that. And the house to the right is my mum's house now. And her and my dad had bought these two bushland blocks adjacent to it when there was a little farm that got subdivided to make that new road down the western side of her property. In the sort of early 80s, and they just sort of bought it to keep it and keep that amenity that Ian described of living next to the bushland. So this project happened as a new build house for my sister, her husband and two little kids, in 2019. But I'd sort of grown up on these blocks, you know. I've got incredible memories of building a tree house here with my father, and looking for fool's gold in the old granite boulders and all that sort of thing. Is a really intact sort of ecosystem there. There's wallabies and goannas and stuff, and it's 15 minutes from the Brisbane CBD. So when we first sort of went to the site to look at seriously designing for the first time, the block is almost 1 in 2 in parts, and sort of characterised by these huge eucalypts. I'll just go backwards quickly, but you can see, because it's so steep, there's barely any undergrowth actually. It's just sort of these columnal sort of huge eucalypts. And rather than being sort of focused on the outward view as one might normally be, we were much more sort of struck by that sort of vertiginous feeling of leaning back and looking up the slope towards the bushland, because this is literally sort of the bridging block between the back boundary of this sort of starts the national park, and then to the north. So this is the block here on the right, and then to the north is suburbia. So it's a kind of an interesting one in this bushfire sense, because access and egress is really easy, and it's a really directional fire coming down the hill, which helps us, as I understand it. But in the practice session for this, I sort of spoke to the guys about feeling somewhat unsupported in the bushfire thing. So I really am appreciative of what Renew's doing here. Our experience was just that we sort of had a bushfire consultant who classified it, and then it was kind of up to us to do the research and try our best, and also to design something that wasn't just good at dealing with bushfires. It was a good house too, you know, that gave people connection to place, and let them sort of be a backdrop for their everyday life. So the very first marks on the page, this is literally the first drawing, but trying to make a driveway work, trying to make a staircase work. And what ended up happening was that we sort of had this set of stairs that emerged that went directly into the contour. So that feeling of moving through the site and into the bushland was always the scheme, you know. The house was really secondary to that movement path of our childhood, me and my sister's childhood. And so that was the most efficient access. And then there was this sort of what we came to see as sort of occupiable contours, so that every time there was a landing, then the room sort of branched off that. And the whole house is essentially a single-storey house that's just spread up the hill, sort of almost at the same pitch as the slope, to try and catch that one courtyard space in the middle, so that little kids could have a grounded courtyard space adjacent to the living area. We also do the landscaping in our projects, and often we're trying to get wilderness sort of spaces into suburban areas, and this was almost the inverse. I'd grown up sort of siphoning the garage at my mum's house through a hose every time it rained, and so we sort of moved all the wet walls of the project, all the retaining walls back, and created these little lush courtyards adjacent to the living spaces and bedrooms that sort of dealt with water, but also gave us a chance to pull in this sort of existing lush landscapes that happened every time there were sort of little flattenings in the contours. I won't talk too much to the plan, but just back to that sort of idea of that central staircase and then branching off either side. So our BAL rating was BAL 40 down the hill and to the east and the west. So the top of our page here in the bottom, and then towards the street was BAL 29. So it was good because it allowed us to use screen louvers on that face to the north, and then we used sort of BAL 40 rated Anitas to the south up the hill, and then fixed glass or solid doors the other directions. We sort of embraced the sort of aesthetic of it, and there's literally no external maintenance apart from cleaning, and the gutters and leaves obviously is a really regular thing that they do. There was no painting externally. The building's built out of what you can see. Each time it's off the ground, it's timber, and each time it connects with the ground again, it's concrete. So you're sort of aware of where you are in the topography. And, there's moments where you're sort of looking into a tiny little bit of bushland, moments when you're sort of connecting into that canopy again. And the whole time it kind of matches the slope of the hill, and you move through it and back out into the bushland and up and continue up into the hill beyond, So that's me, Nathan.
Brilliant. Thanks, Morgan. Great to learn about that project. All right, so we'll bring Nigel back as well for a quick chat. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll try to get to one or two. Over to you, Nigel.
Well done, Morgan. Obviously a lovely project, highly durable, of very long life materials that have every good chance of surviving a fire, irrespective of what the BAL level actually is. But let me ask you just a couple of questions. You mentioned the fact that because of the steepness of the land, you've kept a low profile with the roof, but obviously for good design reasons, you have courtyards that look out left or right as you move up the central spine of stairs. So would you just like to expand on that? What have you done to minimise the risk? Because typically those areas are those that would catch burning embers.
It was sort of more intuitive, I think, than scientific, if I'm being honest, But that sort of feeling, I think a lot of the time it was because it was easier to comply for us to do doors, than windows as well as the water element. So we could, the doors were much easier for us to get, and more sort of cost effective. This house was $4,500 a square metre, which I think is pretty good price for sort of, building on a 1:2 slope in BAL 40. So that the windows and doors took a great deal of that budget. Talking to Ian in the last thing and yourself, I think the lush landscaping close to the building might contribute positively to that. But look, having grown up in a timber weatherboard house next door, we were designing it to be durable and designing it to comply in the best way that we understood and knew, but it certainly doesn't. I don't think it has the complications of some of those rural sites where getting away is really difficult. So they would get out of there very fast in any sort of danger.
Yes, that's obviously a key factor. Access and egress in an emergency is obviously one of the most vital things in terms of life safety. And the buildings usually have to defend themselves. And particularly when you've got the trees that close overhanging, because again, standard consideration of the regulations in most states prohibit overhanging branches, overhanging foliage, because that's the first thing that catches the light and of course will fall into gutters. But you've got gutter guard, don't you, on your home for starters?
Yeah, it's all sealed. The whole sort of water system is sealed with gutter guard, and then they're all directly plumbed into an enormous tank, 27,000 litres or something like that. And that's all sort of back into laundry, sprinklers, all those. We don't have a fire sprinkler system, but all those sort of gardens all have sprinklers that are attached to that. So that sort of, that's been helpful as well.
Yes, yes. And well, Queensland has always had very low BAL ratings because the forest fire danger index starts at 40. When you just go across the border, New South Wales or Victoria, and it goes immediately to 80, or many parts 100. So immediately it makes your BAL 40 house, if it was interstate, southern, would become flame zone. So with that in mind, you've said this was the first house you've done in terms of fire. Are you conscious of what you might do differently if, in fact, you had got a flame zone?
Well, we've since done a couple of flame zone houses, to be honest, and I think if any day of the week that house would be flame zone now. I don't know why that's changed. I'm not across that exactly, but it feels like a lot of Brisbane has sort of been blanketed with fire overlays that a lot of places that it's just crazy. There's no sort of bushland anywhere near it, but then other ones that sort of face on that same forest actually, everything facing the rear was BAL. It was flame zone, and then everything facing the side boundaries was BAL 40. So we were able to sort of use some of those techniques with doors and that sort of thing, sort of to the east of our site rather than the west on those ones. And it's sort of, I think it was about carving the building outline, so we got more opportunity to have operable edges, and then the flame zone ones were just fixed. We just sort of
right. So again, it's conscious design to address the problems or the difficulties associated with bushfire and the regulations. Is that a reasonable statement?
I think it is, but it's also, it's got to still be a good house, and so it's, I don't know. I think people, it's got to be that balance of having somewhere that is, and again, it's all particular to the site.
Yes.
And that thing of that every other house that faces on that is timber is like, these houses are going to be infinitely better. But yeah.
Yep. No, well done, Nathan.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Morgan. Nigel, let's move to our final case study for this evening. So we're going to be looking at Eagle Hawk Nest next by Green Design Architects and Coot-tha Green. Coot-tha has been dedicated to sustainable architecture all her professional life. She co-established Green Design Architects 20 years ago in Tasmania, and the practice enjoys transforming the challenges of the natural setting and local climate into architecture that inspires and delights. So Coot-tha wanted to remain off camera tonight, but is available to answer questions that are put in the Q&A. So feel free to still ask those, and I'm going to take us through her presentation now, if you'll just bear with me while I pull it up. Beautiful. So this is a small home for a couple in the town of Eagle Hawk Neck on the other side of the Tasman Peninsula, not far from Port Arthur. It was built in 2021. The setting is a stunning slope of dry sclerophyll regrowth forest above Pirates Bay to the northeast of the peninsula. This narrow, very steep block, the bushfire distances and the AES wastewater treatment system forced the location of the house in the middle of the hill, which made access difficult, but the resulting view across the bay is absolutely stunning, as we can see. Unfortunately, on this suburban-sized block, a number of trees had to be removed, especially to the north of the house. However, this was to the benefit of passive solar gain. The southern wall, as seen here, is not glazed, but to minimise heat loss and privacy issues. The southern wall, as we can see, is not glazed, both to minimise heat loss and privacy issues, as it's close to the boundary. All rooms face the bay, and because the generous glazing faces east, there is no risk of overheating. The builders were challenged by the request to retain selected trees so close to the house. The mature white gums are important to frame the view and retain natural amenity of the site, as well as offering foraging ground to local threatened species. The eastern facade is offering a hugging gesture to the bay. The living and master bed can be divided by a sliding wall or enjoyed as a continuous entity. The living space makes good use of the northern sun, and all rooms are enjoying the water view. This also goes for the back bedroom and the loft. The architects and owners were determined to arrive at a minimal footprint, and the resultant 83 square metre main floor area, not including the loft and undercroft storage area, proves ample for 2 adults and occasional guests. By organising spaces to overlap in function, the reduced floor area minimises the heating requirements and the embodied energy to a fraction of a standard house. The house is lightweight timber construction and high embodied energy materials. Were limited to the steel structure of the decks and the concrete floorings. It will be possible to offset this low energy by feeding solar power into the grid. BAL 29 is the highest bushfire attack level the Tasmanian Fire Service will normally allow. Thus, timber could be used for the exterior cladding. No Tasmanian timber species complies with the BAL 29 required density, and here plantation silvertop ash was used. Other materials also intimately respond to the site, with local mudstone used for cladding and landscaping, recycled Tasmanian oak used in the joinery, and recycled brick in the internal walls. These convict brick internal walls deliver the thermal mass of the house. This picture from the main sleeping space encapsulates the home's focus on livability and the connection to site. The Eagle Hawk Neck house demonstrates that by accepting the challenges of a site, the natural constraints can be turned into advantages for harmonious living. So there were some beautiful shots there. I hope I didn't go too fast for you all, but I'll bring Nigel back in to talk a little bit more about that project.
Yes, again, a very lovely, well-designed project that addresses the steepness of the site, tries to retain trees and vegetation, even though some have had to be removed. And of course, its downslope is where a fire would progress more slowly than upslope. So again, like several of these, when the vegetation below the house is more limited and or is less flammable or less intense, then there's a better likelihood of getting a lower BAL rating, bushfire attack level, and that's radiant heat. And up to BAL 29, as we've just seen officially, you can use one of 6 or 7 timber species that are Appendix F at the back of AF 3959. There are other species that arguably may be as good, but again, you're going to need specialist input, engineering input, if you want to argue for other timber species. Yes, the livability, the deck, the steel frame, the use of recycled materials wherever possible, all adds to its sustainability credentials. And obviously, it's a very lovely place to be. So well done, Coot-tha Green, a lovely bushfire resilient home.
Beautiful. Thanks, Nigel. And after the discussion ends, Coot-tha can answer any remaining questions in the Q&A section, just so you know. Okay, so before we begin our group discussion, I'd like to introduce Chris Ferreira from Western Australia. Chris founded the Ferreira project, which delivers a set of programs helping government, business, community groups, and individuals meet the challenges of the 21st century. He's pioneered beautiful Firewise landscaping designs, which effectively resist ember attack and fire creep while maintaining a cool vegetated landscape. Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Hi there, guys, and lovely to be able to talk to you from Western Australia, and I'm pleased to say it's cooled down a bit. We had a pretty brutal start to the summer, and my apologies, my internet's not really working at the moment, so I was going to show you a presentation, but I'm pretty good at winging it, and thank you for the first 3 presentations. They were just sensational, and it's very heartening. I come from a very, very different perspective. I'm not an architect. I'm not a planner. I'm a sustainability practitioner. I did a degree in forestry and then have specialised in land management and developing resilient communities. And I've been teaching sustainability through my business, the Ferreira Project, since 1992. And we've done lots of workshops helping people on small farms, small to medium-sized farms. And way back then in 92, fire was something we would talk about and we would discuss. But now, because of the impacts of climate change, it's jumped the queue. And so now it is front and centre. So my history, we've done lots of work in WA on what we call WaterWise. And it's probably one of the best programs in the world for consistent bipartisan support, educating West Australians about developing drought-proof, climate-resilient landscapes. So I've been teaching that for a long time. So for me, it was quite a logical next step to say, well, we know what WaterWise is, and there's a fantastic set of parameters that allow us to really quite concisely show what is a WaterWise garden. So for me, it was not much of a step to then say, well, let's tweak that to create what's called a FireWise garden. And building on what Ian was saying before, the overwhelming majority of homes that are destroyed through catastrophic fire, it's the impacts of ember attack. And most people go, what? No, surely it's the flames. And I say, well, no, it's the embers. They're the ones, they're the scouts. They're coming first. And just like a virus that's trying to get into your body, these embers are trying to get into and destroy your house. So for us, a FireWise garden is creating a starvation diet for those embers. So when they land, they've got nothing to feed on because an ember becomes a flame, which then destroys the house. So when those embers land, we want them to have absolutely nothing to feed on. So like Ian, I'm passionate about sustainable landscaping. And to me, a home only becomes a home when it is designed with a garden. The garden should be the biggest room of your home. It should not be something that is destroyed because we have some pretty crude, blunt instruments, which is the BAL ratings. And I love what you were saying, Ian, about getting a really good BAL assessor. We have lots of cowboys in WA who will have as a default just destroy all the vegetation and be safe. The reality is, as we know, that's not making you safe, and it's going to make you pretty miserable and uncomfortable. So the FireWise gardens that we've designed and are developing as a program are really about helping get this out into the community, that you can have gardens that are climate resilient, that are going to give you a beautiful, productive and sustainable and fundamentally a safer space to live. And this is backed up through, obviously, the Royal Commission reports into the Black Saturday fires, which basically, when they did their grisly work of forensically looking at the aftermath of the fires and how homes fared or didn't fare through the impacts of those catastrophic fires, they found that there were two types of homes that had a much more significant chance of surviving those catastrophic impacts. One was a lush garden, and we don't have much chance of a lush garden in WA. So we say, you want a lush garden, you've got to have grey water, fill your boots, shower and laundry water, use that to create a lush garden. But for us, the interesting thing that they teased out was as well, the other style of garden that had a better chance of surviving was a well-managed garden. Now, they didn't know what FireWise was, but now they would agree if they looked at what we deem to be a FireWise garden. They go, that's it. It's all of these principles. So that gave us the confidence to know that if we are showing people the principles of a FireWise garden, this can allow you to have a beautiful home and at the same time design a garden that meets all of those needs that we want in a garden, but it can help to protect us against the impacts of fire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those principles now. So at the moment, I'm really focusing on that APZ, the fire protection zone, that 20 to 40 metre area around the home, which is obviously where we can make or break the impacts of the fire. And when we do these workshops and when we do our work, we say to people, our job is to show you that if you choose to live in higher fire risk regions, you love the bush, you want to be away from the suburbs, absolutely, bring it on, great thing to do. But you need to accept that you need to meet the fireys halfway. It's your responsibility. And sadly, the media, like most of the things the media does, it paints a pretty unrealistic impression. So whenever there's a catastrophic fire, you can guarantee the images on the TV or splashed across newspapers are of fixed-wing bombers, helicopters. If it's a big event, marching reservists sort of stamping their feet out of a Hercules. So it gives the impression that the cavalry, i.e. these brave men and women through the fire and emergency services, are going to come, knock on your door, calmly take you away when a fire is there. It's simply not the case. You are on your own. You don't have much of a chance that these people are going to be able to protect you. You must design your property so it is defendable. And that's where we believe the Firewise garden comes in. So the main principles of a Firewise garden are, number one, you look at the landscape that you have and you ascertain where the risks are coming from. Get the compass out, put north point, and then you know where the prevailing winds are. And the prevailing winds are one thing, the hot, dry winds, but then match it with how much fuel load there is, topography, all the things that our wonderful first presenters have talked about. So you get an understanding of where the major fire risks are coming from. By all means, please get the BAL assessment done, and please get it done by a BAL assessor who has a strong ecological integrity as well, because otherwise, their default is just clear everything. And I loved what Ian was saying, and we really stressed that point when he was talking about managing the understory, and I'll get to that point in a moment. So once you can ascertain where the major risks are coming from, then you can start to do the following Firewise designs within that APZ. And if I have time, I'll talk about the broader property as well. So number one for a Firewise garden is the existing vegetation that you keep, and we urge you to keep as much as possible. We basically recommend, and Ian was touching on this, canopy lifting. Remove those lower branches, get rid of the ribbony bark, and if you can, get an arborist in to do canopy thinning. So you're opening up the crown. What people don't understand is during big catastrophic fires, you have those very strong winds. The plants are already under stress, so they're weakened. So you can have strong winds. If it's a big, thick canopy, then it's more likely in those, and this is my hand simulating the strong winds, more likely branches are going to break, can breach the house, embers are in, house is gone. But a good arborist and not a tree lopper, never let a tree lopper near any trees that you love. An arborist or a tree surgeon will come in, look at the tree, assess it, do canopy thinning. So you open up the crown a bit so it's much more porous and semi-permeable, so it's less likely to violently sway in the wind. It's going to be stronger, more vigorous, and less likely to be negatively impact if a fire comes through. So the canopy lifting, absolutely critical. And we say trim those branches back from the gutters so you're not getting that rain of leaf litter coming down. Number two is, wherever possible, you use your fire retardant plants for any landscaping that you do. So you're keeping whatever plants, particularly the trees. If there are fire flammable shrubs, we would say they need to really be probably removed if they're close to windows and all those other areas where breaches could occur. So Firewise plants. What's a Firewise plant? Well, a Firewise plant is one of those plants that is deemed to burn very well. It'll grudgingly burn, or it won't burn at all. The caveat is all things will burn, as we know, but the reality is, if carefully chosen and well managed and well placed, Firewise plants are less likely to burn, so they slow that fire down. So that's what we're trying to say. Slow it down, starvation diet. So in WA, we have a fantastic, as I said, WaterWise program that has over 1,500 registered WaterWise plants. And of that list of about 1,500 WaterWise plants, there's about 200 that would be deemed to be fire retardant. So there's many species. And we then, with our Firewise designs, ask the client, well, do you want it to be only natives, or do you want to include cottage gardens or succulent gardens or productive gardens or locally endemic? You can design the garden whatever you want, or to have whatever styles that you want, but the key is fire retardant plants. The third step is gaps, horizontally and vertically. And I touched on the vertical laddering effect with our big trees, but it's the same with any plants that you put in place. You're making sure there are gaps, because as we say to our audiences, fire is lazy. If there's a tangle of dead and dying vegetation that's sort of climbing up into the gutters or up into your big trees, it's just nirvana for those embers. You need to make it really difficult for those embers when they land. And then horizontally, there are gaps between your plants. Very, very important. And when we've done these demonstration Firewise gardens, sometimes well-meaning council landscapers will come in afterwards and infill with plants, which to me is a little bit like looking at a piece of art on a wall in a art gallery and going, well, there's a few gaps there, I'll just paint in some stuff. No, we have the gaps deliberately. This garden is different from a typical garden. It has to balance those firewise needs with habitat, etc. And then very, very importantly, this is the big one, is the mulches that we use. And I love wood mulches. Of course, we've had 30 years of really encouraging people to mulch their gardens. What we need to say is if your BAL rating is high, you've got to take a deep breath and say that you don't use woody mulches and pea straw and lupin hay if your BAL rating is high, because those are magnificent fodder for embers. So we recommend stone and gravel, but we take it one step further, and we have mountains and mountains and mountains of construction and demolition waste in Australia, which is being diverted from landfill, but generally speaking, there's not many markets for it yet. So we encourage people to use construction and demolition waste materials for the rubble and paths. And we have fantastic programs we've done here working with our major C&D waste companies. So we have rubble of different sizes, different colours, and we use it for our paths. We use it for the different swirls and colours of mulches. And we use it for gabions, for filling with good, big, coarse chunks of recycled material. It looks really cool, urbane, postmodern, really, really cool stuff. So the key is those gaps and using those recycled mulches. And the typical question we get all the time is, doesn't that heat up and cause problems for the plants? The answer is no. Rubble mulches are actually the most effective water-wise mulch that we have because they absorb virtually no water. And because of all those gaps, there's no thermal mass and the water goes through into the soil. So if you have those really hot, dry days like we get in Perth, it stops capillary action, sucking the moisture back out again. So these rubble mulches are actually really, really good at keeping the water in the soil, getting it in there in the first place, and therefore keeping our plants wonderfully hydrated. So the fourth and final point with our design is management, management, management. It's a bit of a spin on the location. But if you don't manage these gardens, if you're not out there managing them, well, within a couple of years, that rain of leaf litter, and in WA, it's 1 tonne per hectare per year, and it's much higher in certain more productive parts of Australia. So if those fine fuels are landing on your landscape, then very quickly you're going to render your Firewise garden obsolete. So from our perspective, this gives you some amazing opportunities to design these gardens. But we weave in the habitat opportunity as well. There are lots of things you can put into a garden that are not plants and they don't burn. Bird baths, gabion baskets filled with chunky recycled materials so it looks really funky, big logs that are debarked and burnt so they're blackened, magnificent things. They form radiant heat shields as well for you in a real emergency, but also animals can shield behind them as well. And we also, of course, include things like metal sculptures, big logs, I mentioned logs, rocks. All of these things are magnificent things to put within these Firewise gardens. So our perspective is we're just trying to keep chipping away at this notion that to live in a high fire risk area safely, you have to compromise the garden. And we say, absolutely, that's not the case. In fact, it's the opposite. A well-designed, well-managed Firewise garden will significantly increase your safety and the defendability of your home. So from our perspective, as a program, we just got some funding from the National Emergency Management Agency. And our job is to now go and put more of these Firewise gardens in high-profile space. My dream, my vision is that every single fire station and every single admin station and every rec centre in high fire risk areas across Australia and indeed fire-ravaged parts of the world has demonstration Firewise gardens there with beautiful signage, QR codes, and we do regular workshops there showing people how you create beautiful Firewise gardens. And I'm not saying for a moment that we have the running on every single style of garden. We just want to start to introduce this as a concept so that people begin to understand that they can build these beautiful gardens that will make them safer and more resilient in these spaces. So with that 18 Firewise gardens that we'll be installing in the southwest of WA, we're targeting fire stations and, as I said, admin and rec centres And we do them as public events. So we install 90% of them. And then as a public performance with headsets and microphones in front of the audience, we install the last parts of the garden, showing people how you design these gardens, how you do it, how you can transfer all of this information home and tweak your own designs. Because the reality is we have millions of people at risk who have poorly designed homes and gardens. And our job is to really help them in that space.
Thanks so much, Chris. So much great advice and insights there. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad you did that. I just would have kept going.
I know, I could feel it. We could have kept listening to you, but we do have to move on to our panel discussion.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to invite all of our other panel members back to the screens. So we're going to move into a discussion around high vegetation risk. And just a reminder that you can submit your questions for the panel in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I can see many of you have been doing that. And we'll use the rest of the time that we have together to discuss this week's topic, which is high vegetation risk and bushfire resilient design. So Nigel, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with a very general question around what is high vegetation risk and how does it impact the BAL rating?
Well, it's a starting point in terms of all bushfire attack level assessments. The Australian standard is a very broad brush and it has 28 vegetation types, where some of the gentlemen here, particularly Ian, would point out that CSIRO in Queensland has developed over 120 individual vegetation types, each with different characteristics when it comes to fire. So this is part of our problem. The broad brush, as distinct from the highly site-specific, and then getting it over the line, getting the regulators who usually want simplicity, don't want complexity, that architects and good landscape designers introduce into the mix. So certainly of the different vegetation types, obviously you've got fires at ground level, often intense, burning all the fine fuels and the leaf litter, all those things at ground level, which can be quite separate from the burning embers, which could be kilometres to the side or 20 kilometres ahead, driven by wind and starting new fires all over the countryside. As Ian pointed out early, 80 to 90% of building losses actually come from burning embers, not the bushfire attack level of radiant heat that follows. So we've had some very good advice from these different people this evening about the landscaping and the fire characteristics, as well as what kind of house might you want to locate where. But obviously that's the point of taking it further in this panel discussion. So let's move on.
Yeah, so noting the huge ecological variations across Australia in terms of vegetation types, and their flammability and bushfire hazard, I want to ask all of you for some comments and advice around what you'll be offering, what you offer regarding your area of practice. So Morgan, I might go to you to kick us off with your perspective on Queensland.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question, Nathan.
So just kind of broad comments, advice in terms of your area of practice around the variation of vegetation types and their flammability, bushfire hazard.
I'm not sure whether it sort of answers that, but we were talking in the practice session that we did a project in Fingal Head, which is sort of just south of the border in northern New South Wales, and it's a very different process, a very different sort of landscape. It was just on the ocean there in the sort of dunes. And that was our experience too, was that we needed to get access to a bushfire consultant of a certain level of training, who was able to sort of do a more in-depth report than just doing the standard sort of classification report, which we found really helpful actually. And she was going to do that for us, which then meant that we could detail the house in a different way, rather than it just being a blanket flame zone sort of thing. She was going to do a much more in-depth analysis of the existing landscape. But to my mind, that feels like a much more sensible way of doing it if you have the opportunity, and also makes it much more, to your point, Nigel, it takes the broad brush thing and it makes it specific. We're craving an expert on that stuff to sort of point us in the right direction, and the small cost in the scheme of a project but an enormous saving in terms of the way you can detail a project if you get good advice from them on how you might sort of limit that.
Chris, do you want to tell us a bit about your experience over there in Western Australia?
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think it's fair to say that WA has famously it's called the dry sclerophyll forests, and we have lots of them, and so it's a massive issue for us. So typically most of our forest where people are living is say 5 to maybe 800 mils of rain, and we're the fastest drying part of the world's driest continent. So we're really getting hit pretty hard by climate change here. So a great bulk of people are living really in extremely risky parts of the country. So we have, and I guess I'm jumping around a bit, but we also have a fairly interesting relationship with our fire control or conservation agency, which is called Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. So their attitude to bushfire management is to just burn 220,000 hectares per year. That's how they are showing to the public that they're trying to manage the fuel risk with hazard reduction burning. But similar to large parts of Australia, it's a pretty crude, blunt instrument. And so we get big areas that are burnt, which are not necessarily having any positive impact on reducing the impact of fire around people's properties. So what we are passionately advocating is we get a lot more input from traditional owners where that traditional wisdom still exists. And lots of WA, it's been so completely ravaged, there isn't really that elder connection anymore. But where it exists, there's so many amazing opportunities to manage and balance that. So we encourage people who are traditionally on bush blocks to do mosaic burning, small patchwork burns, and really nuanced burning where you're doing the creeping fires and trying to stop the fire getting into the middle or even into the higher shrub layer and the middle story, because quite frankly, if you're getting up to that area, you're just burning those leaves. They're then going to fall on the ground and you've got the fuel load all over again. So it's a massive issue for us, and really I think WA has massive threats because we just are constantly at that point where we have very dry fuels and we get a long summer. So it's typical for us to have no rain now till probably March. It's quite common. So it's a pretty risky part of the world to be living in with that risk of fire.
Yeah. Ian, you work across various states. Do you want to?
Yeah, in a way you kind of think, well, there's so much variety in landscape types in Australia. It's kind of crazy that there's even a national standard, Yeah. If I can sort of, following on, sort of segue from Chris, that landscape I presented for my little project, that kind of folly down in southern WA where I'm from, that landscape is getting more and more and more fuel load the more it's burnt. And it's typically burnt from lightning strike. So, we get dry lightning. And so you get all these pioneer species like the wattles and so on come in, and it just gets this increasing kind of thing. And Chris might be quite familiar with the Fitzgerald River National Park, which is the big conserve of this quongan vegetation in WA. And yes, that Department of and Attractions is doing everything it can to just keep burning it, and in effect actually increasing the fire risk, increasing the fuel loads, and reducing the biodiversity. So we've still got a lot of learnings to do. But another thing is speed and fire. So we talk a lot about radiant heat and that presenting itself to the house, but for how long is it happening? And, a bushfire in my heathland, we're talking seconds. If I can duck into a house, even if it's not even regulated, I'll be able to come out before the darn thing's on fire, and the landscape will be like, as long as I got some decent shoes on, I'll be fine, because it's all just gone. And so, that's the variety we've got in this landscape. When you go to King Lake and you've got the opposite, where you've got trees burning for days, you compare that to a heathland landscape that basically vaporizes in front of your eyes. Sure, it gets really hot, but it's very, very quick. This is another nuance that isn't actually embedded in the Australian standard. The Australian standard for bushfire design calls up other standards, which are testing standards. They actually don't represent what's actually happening. They don't represent very well actually what's happening with regards to bushfire. They're better at representing what happens in commercial kind of building fires. So my basic view on this is that we are just starting. We are only just starting to adapt in this country. Black Saturday 2009 was a trigger for adaptation. Black Summer another one, but we're only just starting. It's going to take generations of us to work out all this stuff.
Yeah, thanks. Nigel, I'm going to ask you for some general comments there as well, and I'm going to tack on another audience question if you can speak to this. So the question is in the chat there. It says, should bushfire risk created by unmanaged, highly flammable introduced species on Crown land blocks ought to be managed by neighbouring landowners or by Crown Land Services themselves? If you can speak to that.
Just quickly on the last one, it obviously comes back to who is the owner, the legal owner of that land, having first and ultimate responsibility. Whether council or the fire authority steps in to point out that you have an elevated risk and then require some treatment, fuel reduction, that depends very much on the local situation. But no, every individual property owner is meant to maintain their own property in a reasonable manner. And of course, you can then debate what's reasonable. But going back to the broad thing, yes, thank you, gentlemen. It's been a very useful round discussion in terms of flammability, because as Chris said and alluded to, all plants will burn under particular circumstance. But I think in the audience, you should be aware that the Victorian Country Fire Authority has an excellent publication, which is on the web, CFA, and it's about garden design. And in that, it has 4 different ecologies, 4 different planning regimes. So it shows you on a plan how you can actually configure a garden to reduce your fire risk. At the same time, that same publication has 12 different qualities of vegetation, which will assist in being fire retardant or help with being defendable space. So it's an excellent free product available, Country Fire Authority Victoria, and you just put into your web browser something about garden design and bushfire. The other point is the comment that we've had earlier several times about the background qualifications or knowledge base of our BPAT assessors, because the bushfire assessors are usually, people who've got a first career in a whole range of things, be it building certification, be it surveyors, be it builders, whatever. But again, I have 3 different people I use for different purposes. The one that's got a doctorate in plant ecology in my region, obviously when that's a key matter to be debated. The woman who is a previous senior building certifier. So if we're talking about the minutiae of regulations, and then another person who's the least expensive, if we already know what it is, just want a BAL rating. So look at the background of the people doing the assessment and find the right person for your project and your needs.
Great, thanks. So I want to talk about hydrating the landscape, which is a new buzzword within the bushfire building world. I want to ask you, Ian, Morgan, and Chris, do you see this as important when it comes to building in bushfire areas, hydrating the landscape? Ian, do you want to kick us off with that one?
Yeah, thanks. Great term. And, in general terms, yes, it's great to have a fire-wise garden. I guess my view is that any trees are better than none because, not only do they transpire and release moisture into the atmosphere, drawing it from the ground and wherever, the garden tap, they're creating a microclimate. So, with the shade and so on, it's just reducing, the ignitability, because fundamentally we're talking about stuff being ignited. So, stuff travelling through the air at great speed generally during a bushfire, probably half of it's not even on fire yet. And then, the embers rocking up and burning it. So it doesn't matter if you've got a timber deck designed to BAL 29, you might find that spot on that deck is going to be flame zone pretty quickly in that scenario. So, or that garden mulch and so on. So reducing ignitability with water is kind of like a 101 kind of approach. You got to have it. But if we can speak more on the Grand Continental scale, my understanding of the Indigenous, fire kind of project on the continental scale is to increase canopy, to reintroduce canopy back into desertified landscapes and cool the ground temperatures down, increase soil moisture. We can't get a high FFDI, i.e. catastrophic conditions, without reduced soil moisture. You need basically, drought conditions to get catastrophic conditions. It's not like a daily kind of forecast from the bomb. It creeps up and creeps up and creeps up, and then suddenly you've got those underlying drought conditions plus a really hot day plus a lot of wind. And then away you go. You've got the ignitability has gone through the roof. So don't ever wait for a fire on the horizon. Make sure that you're out of that place or whatever your plan is when that ignitability gets up. So sorry, that's my answer.
Great. No, that's great. I'll throw to Morgan and Chris as well. And I'm going to add a question from the audience in here. So someone's asking about what you think of seaweed for mulch. This might be one for you, Chris. I'm not sure. Is it flammable with its inherent salty fibre? Morgan,
that's
Chris, you go. Yeah.
Oh, okay. To carry on from what Ian was saying there, and WA, we have big issues with water repellency. I'll start with that one first. So, in WA, we say you put the wet stuff on the hot stuff, and it's pretty simple. You need to keep your plants hydrated, and plants where their cells are full of water are obviously less likely to burn. So, from a water-wise perspective, we want to get the water to the plants. And in WA, we have a huge issue with water repellency. So we get a wax coating that comes from the breakdown of organic material. And so that stops the water going to the plants, and therefore we waste a lot of water, but we also keep our plants dehydrated so they're more likely to burn. So from our perspective, well-hydrated landscapes, as everyone has been talking about, is absolutely critical. So we have a saying, use the water and the nutrients where they fall. So for us, it's designing water-sensitive urban design. Those same principles occur and should be used in any landscaping. So your landscapes are lower than hard surfaces, so the water is going towards the plants. You use those very permeable mulches. And then in terms of the seaweed, yes, there's a high salt content, and you may or may not know that a lot of the more fire retardant species have salt in them. So blue bushes and salt bushes are very good. My gut feeling would be the seaweed, once it really dries out, it's still probably going to burn. So what I say to people when they're passionate food growers, and they obviously are wanting to use the pea straw, the lupin hay and the seaweeds, is that during that fire season, you just need to really resist using them. And it might be 3 to 4 months of the year where you just don't use those highly flammable materials. But in a nutshell, everything we need to do in the landscape is about keeping our plants as hydrated as possible, because that does make them more likely to, as Ian said, be putting that moisture into the landscape, but also those cells of those plants full of water means they're just going to be slower to burn. And again, it's all about giving us that precious bit of time to get ahead of the fire so we can defend our properties and hopefully save it and our lives.
Right. Morgan, did you want to add anything on that conversation?
I think Chris is the expert there.
Yeah, sure. All right, well, we'll move to another question. This one's about how you see the balance between bushfire hazard and bushfire risk. Maybe some general comments. We'll start with you, Morgan. So that is the hazard of unmanaged bushland, and then the risk to houses and people within that setting. Should we be building in bushland in the future?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's not a choice. And if the choice is to demolish everything and make all these outer ring suburbs like, the governments think is okay, designing terrible houses in completely cleared, what was bushland things, and that's not a good solution either. I don't know. It's quite inspiring, I think, sort of seeing the work, seeing Ian's work or something that's just so technically, it's really technically focused, but still, achieving really great architectural outcomes. And I think it's something that buildings are a result of a whole bunch of inputs, and if bushfire is one of those inputs, in the same way that landscape or flooding or the humans that are going to live in the thing are those inputs, and the building needs to sort of find itself as a result of those inputs. And I think it's a much more optimistic and exciting thing to design a building that can be really good at managing bushfire than designing something that's really good at being the simplest version of the code. I don't know. I don't know whether you guys, but
yeah, what are you thinking?
Look, I think that was beautifully said. I mean, I just have a byline that I keep repeating, that bushfire is a catalyst for creativity. That's it. And if architects, I thought architects were all creative, so let's get on the project, you know.
Yeah.
I just on that. I think it's, you know, for us it turned into a really exciting thing. Like, I'm in no way am I claiming that I know anything about the bushfire stuff, but the thought that the house looks and feels like a sensible solution to, you know, that input, which is obviously a huge input on that site, you know, in the same way that we're doing a house in the middle of suburbia, but it's in a horribly flooding site just from flash floods, not from river floods. And the building needs to necessarily become something that is different, you know, and it will be a creative solution if we can ever do it. And you know, it doesn't work to just do a Metricon 200 grand, slap it up, air conditioned thing there. It's got to be something more. That's the exciting thing about architecture. It's just problem solving.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm just going to ask one more question. I might hand over to you, Nigel, and if you have any other thoughts as well on some of the topics we've been exploring. But this one I wanted to speak to is around insurance. So noting the reported cost increases for insurance cover, still higher with flood, storm and tempest. What are your thoughts as to where this may lead in the near future with increasingly severe bushfires? So I'll hand over to you, Nigel, and if anyone else wants to add to that, please do.
Sure. I mean, obviously, there's been debate in the paper about insurance cost, insurance risk. And certainly I remember 2009, where I spent time in Marysville and that area. About 1/3 of the householders did have insurance, which covered them. Then there was a third who was totally underinsured, and that was largely the result that they had no idea about the additional cost rebuilding after a fire. And then there was a third that had nothing and lost everything. So just as the federal government some years ago had to basically provide reinsurance to the insurance companies in Northern Australia to cover their risk so that they could still offer insurance, we are probably going to be heading in that direction with flooding and also bushfire given time. You probably well know that the repeat fires that they've had in northern New South Wales, flooding, 4 floods in 1 year, 2 of them higher than ever before recorded. So the jargon is a planned retreat. Now, that's not going very well at the moment. But again, you can see that when there is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million existing buildings in high or extreme bushfire attack level risk, that given time, a planned retreat might become mandated or certainly politically promoted as the way for people not to keep building along dirt roads in the middle of nowhere in bushland settings, which of course has been the lovely ideal for many of us for most of our lifetime. I think in the age of consequence, we're going to see more regulation in that direction, whether we like it or not, often led by insurance costs.
Did anyone else want to speak to that? We've probably got one more comment.
The holy grail for me is that insurance companies will start to provide subsidies to people who have done a whole farm plan for their property, with a strong emphasis on the design of the fire safe zone around the property, but the entire property. Where's the egress and ingress? Where are the windbreaks? How are they managing their pastures so that they become green living fire breaks? Because we know, just like insurance companies would give a reduction in your premiums if you had deadlocks and bolt locks on your house because you had less likelihood of being broken into, we know that if people have a well-designed and well-managed property, so they have a mandated plan, we believe the insurance companies could start saying, show us that plan that's been recognised by your local agency and we'll give you a 30% discount in your rates. I believe that's where we need to get to. So that we can have people living there. But short answer is, we need to be doing so much better at the way we design our communities. And given that so few homes are actually well designed with beautiful architecture like we've seen today, personally, I just think we should not be building in bushland areas anymore, and a planned retreat, I think, is going to be important. I think we're going to see areas of Australia where they'll say, well, we're just not going to let you live there during the fire season. You can go there in the winter, but you just are not going to be able to live there. You know, you're living in the Otways at the end of a 5-kilometre winding track. Seriously, like how can we possibly defend those people? And it's the same in Western Australia. So I think into the future we've got some tough decisions to make, and unless we have really, really good designs, I really don't support building within bush areas unless it's really with great architects and they've ticked all the boxes to make sure they're doing state-of-the-art design and installation.
Right. We've certainly got them on the panel. So that's all the questions we have time for tonight. If you'd like to know more, you can view the full case studies at your leisure on our Green Rebuild Toolkit website in the Beyond BAL section. If you have found value in these events, please do consider joining Renew either as a member or by donating, as I've mentioned, or taking out a subscription to one of our magazines, Renew or Sanctuary. These are all meaningful ways that you can support our work. Thank you. Big thanks to our panel, Ian, Morgan, Chris, Coot-tha, and Nigel for sharing your time and expertise tonight. And thank you to you all, our attendees, for tuning into this session and for your questions. Wishing you all a very good night. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.